Yeah, sorry, we switched the sound off and things. You can hear us for another. Yeah, sweet. And can you see the slides okay?
It's the forms of
All, I think it all good is all good.
absolutely can't think like.
Well, that's only part of my way.
Oh, I can do that.
You happy? You happy? Let's begin. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Dyke. I'm Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this joint GSI Routes conversation on tipping points and climate change. Today, we're going to be hearing from Ben Hudson, who also has a similarly flamboyant shirt, who is a senior lecturer in law here at the University of Exeter, and Tim Lenton, Professor of Climate Change and Earth System Science, who is revealing his flamboyant and who was also the inaugural director of the GSI. So welcome back, Tim. So I'm just going to briefly outline the format of the event. So we're going to hear 10 minutes from Tim about tipping points, and then we're going to hear 10 minutes from Ben about the impacts of tipping points on migration. Then we will have a Q&A period, I suppose. We're going to put them in the hot seats, and I will moderate the conversation, and we're going to have some questions and hopefully an interesting discussion, both here in the room and online. The purpose of the event today is that we understand that Earth system tipping points provide important markers for large-scale environmental events, and they're set to reshape global migration patterns. We're going to explore the implications of these on triggering such changes in the lives of those in threatened areas who face rising sea level, desertification, and food and water shortages, subsequently driving large-scale migration changes. So as temperatures continue to sail past 1.5 and emissions continue to increase, and as we further develop the understanding and science of tipping points, tipping elements in the climate system, we are increasingly sure that at least some of them can be activated. What massive uncertainties about is the social, political, and economic consequences of them, and hopefully we might be able to unpick some of that today in the context of migration. So to begin, Tim, would you like to come on up? And so just to recap, Tim's going to speak for 10 minutes. We ruthlessly policed in terms of timing, and then we're going to hand over to Ben, and then we'll have a discussion. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, Ben, for organising, inviting me, and everything else. I'm not a migration expert, so I look forward to learning some more in a discussion about that. And I might disappoint you by talking more broadly about what I call the human climate niche before I get to how passing some climate tipping points would affect that on top of global warming. I want to start with just a map of where people live, population density around the world. To give you a sense that, of course, we are an amazingly adaptable species and live in all sorts of places, but crucially, not at the same population density everywhere. And the basis, if you like, what I want to talk about is that the notion that just like any other animal or any other species, there's some kind of human niche, there's some climates in which we tend to attain a higher population density than others. This isn't a fully deterministic thing, but I'll hopefully show you enough evidence to persuade you that that's the case. Aside from the obvious that we don't live at high density in deserts or in cold, frozen places, or indeed in the Amazon rainforest, as you can see on there. So when we, a few years ago, with my ecologist friends, plotted up how various things like human population density, crop production, livestock, GDP depended on temperature on the top row or precipitation on the bottom row, well, you see kind of consistent patterns between these different things. And you see some structure in how, say, on the left, human population density depends on mean annual temperature and precipitation in a baseline interval. So like going from zero precipitation to about a metre of annual precipitation, right, translates into a huge increase in human population density. We don't live at high density in very cold places or extremely hot places. There's an interesting dip in the middle, a major peak, a secondary peak. We should, of course, look backwards in time to see if there's any consistent pattern. And now it has to be the relative population density, because obviously there are more people on the planet now than there used to be. So here, when we've got the yellow and the green curves, they're like 300 years ago and 500 years ago. But you see the relationship of population density with temperature. The relative population density, the pattern is essentially the same. There's some subtle detail in there we can discuss. And in fact, we could try to reconstruct 6,000 years ago, relative human population density. That's not easy to do. And maybe the green reconstruction is what's called the HIDE database is biased by the present. So we made our own reconstruction of something called the ArchaeoGlobe dataset to get the yellow, which looks a bit different to the others, but still there's a couple of humps, a big one and a smaller one, which is amazing given that 6,000 years ago, agriculture is only starting to reach Britain, for example, and still spreading around the world. And there's a lot more, you might call it hunter and gathering going on. But I think part of what this reveals is, as did the previous slide, is that humans tend to be concentrated where their crops grow well and their livestock do well. And even that was only beginning to kick in 6,000 years ago. So if we accept that for all our technological advances, we haven't yet seen a huge change in that relationship of human population density with climate. So we might not want to bank on some kind of technological miracle decoupling us from the climate in the future. And we might instead ask, well, how does where people are projected to be in terms of temperatures and rainfall levels, how's that projected to change as the world warms up and the water cycle changes? In particular, the world is heading towards 2.7 degrees centigrade of warming later this century based on current legally binding policies. Of course, we're all hoping to hold the line closer down here, and we'll have a look at what difference that makes in a minute. But you can take a standard climate projection to a 2.7 degrees C warmer world later this century, and we can have a look at some time slices here going to 2090 later this century. And this is just replotting in a standard population growth scenario, as well as the global warming scenario, or what happens. Well, what happens is obviously things get hotter, so people tend to be living in hotter conditions. But there's also a sort of reweighting, you might say, of the distribution of people and that's partly because, as you probably all know, where's most of the population going on and growth going on in the world? Not in the rich, cooler places, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a hot place. So that's shifting the distribution. However, historically, there was this big dip in the middle, for example. This is because places at those kind of temperatures correlated with quite dry places like north of Africa and the Mediterranean, for example. You see in the future, loads of people get put into those kind of climate, as well as a load of people getting pushed into unprecedented hot temperatures. And that's hot in the annual average. But we looked at a sort of interesting, and whilst you'll see in a minute, sort of, I think, justified kind of threshold level. We looked at how many people are being put into average temperatures of 29 degrees centigrade or above. I picked that partly because when I was born, almost nobody lived at that average temperature, barring a few spots in the Sahara and Mecca, one city. But in the red scenario, I think we'll see in a minute, I think it's about 2 billion people who've been put in unprecedented extreme heat. Now, it's not the average heat that's going to hurt you or in the worst case kill you, but it turns out, unsurprisingly, that the heat extremes that could kill you and certainly do you harm go up with the average. It's kind of intuitive, isn't it? So on the left is the number of days with a maximum temperature over 40 degrees centigrade in terms of dry heat, because physiologists will tell you that's dangerous. not necessarily fatal, but that's dangerous. Black line is 29 degrees C average. Actually, that kicks up at about 27 degrees C because all these blue points are different points from the spatial map of the world. Then wet heat or wet bulb temperature or the combination of heat and humidity. That's physiologically a bigger problem for us than all other mammals because we can't cool ourselves down basically through sweating when we're in moisture saturated air. And when that gets over, well, about 28 degrees C, that starts to cause harm to people. And you see here broadly how that indicator relates to the average temperature on the bottom. It starts to kick up earlier as well, and it really kicks up if you get anywhere near 30, 31. Right. So I then just quickly show a movie of how many places are being put into this unprecedented high average temperatures in purple in a 1.5 degrees C warmer world. And you see already there's at 1.5 degrees C, you've got places like those hot areas have expanded out from places like the Chad Basin and are hitting into the borderlands of, say, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia. We've just gone past, there's a little bit of India where it's starting to go purple. In fact, as we'll see in a minute, there's about 400 million people projected to be exposed to this unprecedented average heat in that version of the world. But now we're going to roll back in a 2.7 degrees C warmer world that we could be heading to later this century and watch like large areas of the Indian subcontinent turn purple. And you'll see larger swathes of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly highly populous countries like Nigeria, projected to have 960 million people later this century in the central population protection, and a large part of South America. So you can see a lot of people are going to be exposed to extreme average heat. We're not catching all the places that are going to get the worst heat extremes, but I've shown there's some correlation. It was about 2 billion people exposed to extreme average heat at 2.7 degrees in the global average. This is where they are in the darker blue. Most of them are, the biggest chunk of them are in India, over 600 million of them, about 700 million, followed by Nigeria, a bit over 100 million, followed by Indonesia, Philippines, Pakistan, Sudan, and so on the left. Okay, and it turns out that every 0.1 degrees C of warming above 1.2, which is about, well, we've gone through that now tragically, is exposing an extra 100 and odd million people to extreme heat. All right, let's finish by talking about tipping points in 20 seconds. So that's what's happening just due to average global warming dialing itself up. And that's all about, I think, passing potentially personal tipping points. They could be in your physiology in the worst case scenario where these conditions could be fatal. And they could also trigger, if we want to talk in this language, migration tipping points. Let's discuss that in the discussion. But there's a rich literature on the fact that you can also conceptualize making the choice to migrate and seeing communities migrate as having tipping dynamics. Lots of social interactions in that. But let's say we don't just have smooth climate change. Let's say we were to pass some of the fabled climate tipping points that I've kind of been, I and many others have been telling the world about. What about the big one in the middle here? That's the tipping point of the so-called Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. Well, Earth history already tells us, because that tipping point's been passed 25 times during the last ice age, it already give us some strong clues that it totally reorganizes the pattern of climate, not just in the Atlantic and not just where we live, but it will shift the whole band of rainfall that rings the tropics. We call it that intertropical convergence zone southwards. When you tip off the Atlantic overturning circulation, which is the risk heading into the future, you can shut down the monsoon in West Africa and in India, and seriously disrupt it in South America and North America and the other monsoon regions. So just to finish up, it's sort of a crude way in which we combined a 2.5 degrees C warmer world with a tipping point in its Atlantic overturning circulation. And first of all, had a look at what it does to the viable area for growing major staple crops, wheat and maize in this case. And you can see from the colour scale that dark purple is catastrophic, sort of elimination of the possibility of growing these crops. Green is good, but there ain't a lot of green on the maps. It's showing you that, okay, it gets better to do some agriculture in Siberia. Good, great. So somebody's going to have to go there to do the agriculture. Will everybody else follow? Let's talk about that in the discussion. But I can tell you that this is a pretty sobering result because globally, the combination of 2.5 degrees of global warming and the tipping point reduces the area to grow these two crops by more than a half worldwide. And then Jesse Abrams in my group has been having a look at, if you combine that scenario with the human climate niche, you ask, where does it get better and where does it get worse for people in terms of the climate niche? I wouldn't overinterpret increased suitability because there's lots of other factors that could be making it worse to live there that we aren't accounting for in this approach. I would pay attention to the red places, which are getting a lot worse in terms of the climate niche in this scenario. And lo and behold, the darkest red I think you might find in a mixture of the UK, the Indian monsoon region, the West African monsoon region. Well, we're fairly populous, but Nigeria, as I mentioned, is incredibly populous, and so is the Indian subcontinent. Thank you very much. I will leave it there and hand over to Ben. Do you want the slides or shall I get rid of them now? Okay, right. Right, so let's go with my slides. Oh, yes, escape. All right, great. Thanks very much.
Online, yes. Great. Hi everyone. Nice to see so many people here, and amazing to see how many people are online as well. Thank you very much, Tim. That was really interesting. Really, it's a paper that I read a long time ago and found really insightful and something that I thought would work really well for these sorts of interdisciplinary conversations where me and my Roots colleagues, many of whom are online, speak about migration, and bringing these two together, I think, is a really, really important dialogue to be having. So I'm a lawyer-ish. I'm not actually a qualified lawyer, but I am based in the law department here at Exeter, and most of my work is on international law. And just something I'm going to talk about here, which I think is potentially an interesting topic to bring into line with this, is the idea of voluntariness or involuntariness in respect to movement and migration of peoples. And some initial thoughts about how not only climate, but also tipping points could have particular dynamics on movement and the question of voluntariness and the agency of people when they are deciding whether or not to move. So in terms of involuntariness, and I use that because I'm going to talk about voluntary and involuntary at the same time, whether rightly or wrongly, it is a core concept in forced migration or displacement studies. Now, I'd say that it's used as a rather blunt tool to differentiate between, therefore to categorize those who are forced to move and those who are deemed to have chosen to have moved. This distinction between forced and voluntary, involuntary, voluntary is central to how international legal and policy frameworks have been constructed. So evidenced by, for instance, the 1951 Refugee Convention, and also the 1998 United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. And I picked the guiding principles on internal displacement, one selfishly because I primarily work on internal displacement, but also from a climate perspective, we are aware that most migration, forced migration as a consequence of climate, tends to be within international borders as opposed to across international borders. So the Refugee Convention and the Guiding Principles both deal with movement that is termed as involuntary. So in the words of the Guiding Principles here, internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence for a non-exhaustive list of reasons. So here we therefore see that involuntariness is central to defining movement for legal purposes. But voluntariness is also central to how legal frameworks respond to involuntary movements. So as the guiding principles here say, when we're thinking about people who have already been displaced, competent authorities have the primary duty and responsibility to establish conditions, etc., which allow IDPs to return voluntarily or to resettle voluntarily. This is further apparent. This is from Principle 28, Sub-Principle 1. Sub-Principle 2 states that special efforts should be made to ensure the full participation of internally displaced persons in the planning and management of their return or resettlement and reintegration. So despite the initial involuntariness of movement, the voluntariness of what happens next is central here. So the decision-making and the agency of the displaced is key in respect to what happens next. So here, if we look at the guiding principles, there's mention of return voluntarily, resettle voluntarily. Although it's not explicitly mentioned here, also the idea of local integration at the site of displacement is also one of the three durable solutions, as they're called, to displacement. Because someone should not be forcibly made to return back to their homes. They should not be forced to resettle elsewhere. They should not be forced, therefore, to leave where they have sought refuge, should they wish to remain in that place. So voluntariness is key there, and this is complemented by, for instance, other UN frameworks that talk about a rights-based approach, ensuring that IDPs are in a position to make a voluntary and informed choice. And also language around how voluntariness depends upon having options to choose from. So I mentioned those three durable solutions of return, local integration, or resettlement elsewhere. The IASC framework here says that the right to choose a durable solution requires that different options, that these options be available. So essentially, if someone returns back to their original home because it is unbearable to remain where they have been displaced to, that is not a voluntary choice. They have been forced into making that choice to return. Similarly, if someone is forced to remain in the site of displacement, but they want to return home, but they cannot return home, then them staying there is not voluntary. So there we see the principle of voluntariness, of demanding that steps be taken to ensure that there are options available. Now, looking briefly to the literature on voluntariness, I think this is really interesting by Serena Ulceretti, because she suggests that a choice is voluntary if and only if it is not made because there is no acceptable alternative to it. So she says that a choice is voluntary when there is an acceptable alternative. So those three durable solutions, if those are available and someone chooses one of those three, then they've made a voluntary choice. But she also says that there may be a situation where someone only has one option, but that could still be a voluntary choice if they choose that option because of it, and not because there's no acceptable alternative. So if there's one option and they choose it because of that option, that's voluntary. If they choose an option because it is the only option and their other options are all closed off to them, then that's not going to be voluntary. So I guess what she's saying there is that this doesn't therefore like voluntariness is not precluded on the basis of a lack of acceptable alternatives, but it does require that a single option is one which, as I say, the agent has chosen because of the option, not because there's no acceptable alternative. Now, turning to tipping points and how these impact movement and questions of voluntariness and involuntariness. I've taken here just, I guess, 3 characteristics, and I am not a scientist, so I apologize if I get any of this wrong. I hope not. I've been around in the community for long enough. But 3 key characteristics around tipping points. So not just thinking about linear climate change, but tipping points bringing with them or being characterized by significant severe magnitude of change that is abrupt and also that is sort of uncertain. And here I'm saying uncertain because from what I understand, we have limited knowledge or understanding of what, say, alternative stable states are going to be like in the future. We don't know how long, if a tipping point is crossed, how long it will be until that stable state is reached, let alone the ways in which people will respond to that, how they may react. So taking these sort of characteristics, these sort of basic characteristics of tipping points, I would speculate that there is the potential to lead to more rapid displacement. I guess what Tim was sort of getting at in his presentation about the human climate niche of potentially larger numbers of people, I keep saying potentially for a reason, but potentially, including in regions less accustomed to population movements. So Tim helpfully ended on the UK as an example. A lot of my work is focused on sea level rise and the consequences in terms of displacement that may occur here in the UK as a consequence of sea level rise. So an area that's less accustomed, perhaps more so across international borders than what we have seen to date in respect to displacement. I'm thinking here about states which are at risk of having no territory remaining as a consequence of climate change and tipping points. And with return made impossible. So I outlined those sort of 3 durable solutions, which we all talk about all the time in migration research, in like displacement research. But tipping points may mean that we have situations where return home is simply not an option anymore. So thinking about those consequences and what they tell us about sort of the voluntariness or involuntariness of movement, it seems to me that tipping points have the potential to impact choices or to limit the choices that people have in terms of how they respond to displacement triggers. So I don't really buy into the idea that people make no choice when they leave their homes. People make a choice, even if they're forced into that, they make a choice. Even in the context of climate change, some of the work I've done is on immobility, so that people may nonetheless choose to remain. But tipping points, maybe, as a consequence of the magnitude of the change and its abruptness, may actually mean that the choice not to move is closed off, and that more people find themselves having to move, including people who would not otherwise move in a climate change scenario. They might find themselves being forced into moving. So that's on the sort of the causes of migration, or migration in advance. But in terms of durable solutions, I also see that tipping points might very well close off traditionally long-held options of durable solutions, in particular the idea of return. And maybe going forward, the human climate niche might mean that there is less scope for resettlement to take place if we are essentially dealing with a smaller land mass. So I think tipping points could really affect the way in which movement happens and could work to limit voluntariness or the choices that are available to people in respect to not only what choice they make as a result of triggers, but also the choices that they make in terms of resolving their own displacement. And for me, I guess this emphasizes the urgency of the situation and the need to start talking about this in advance, i.e. definitely now, no matter how difficult it might be to talk about it, because surely the only way to like promote voluntariness in this sort of situation is to think about the options. And I put this on just as a talking point, thinking more seriously about planned relocation, not as something that has to happen, but something that is an option that we work through so that people can make at least some choice in respect to how they respond to tipping point. Thank you very much.
Come on down. I don't, do they need, or was the, okay. So we don't need to do a roving mic for the,
They should be able to hear online.
okay. Tim will always tell us if he can't hear online. Isn't that right, Tim?
Tim Malone, yeah.
Okay, so what are your questions, comments, observations? If you have one, then please.
These are very willing.
Yeah.
Involuntary migration.
For an inch out of the room. Yeah, please put your hand up, and also if you have any questions online, I think the format is we're going to put them in the chat, and then Harry's going to relay them to us in the room. So, does anybody have any questions, comments? Okay, we've got one here. Any more? So we can. Okay, yes, please.
I'm not really an expert on migration at all. I do know that obviously if the landmass keeps shrinking, is it possible that people have nowhere to go to? It's not so much that you are being forced to move, but there's nowhere to go to anyway.
In the extreme, by which we would mean more extreme than anything I showed you, then eventually, I'm afraid, that that becomes a possibility, but that's a really extreme case. That's like what we call the runaway greenhouse effect, where the planet becomes ultimately uninhabitable to life. We'll stop. Just take some comfort from our current estimates that if it's just due to the brightening of the sun, will be in about 1 billion years' time. Don't have to worry about that one. But yeah, fair point. I would like to emphasize that my biggest concern is about the people who are trapped in some kind of horror show, but in uninhabitable climate trap. Migration is ultimately perhaps one of the best forms of adaptation if it's available to you, if you have the means to migrate. The people I worry about most in everything I showed you are the ones who could be cornered without the means to get away from what becomes, potentially fatal climate conditions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think that in displacement research or migration research, we have tended to have, and perhaps rightly so, greater focus on people who do move when people do move, but at the expense of the broader idea of mobilities and immobilities, which has only in recent years started to get more attention. So I think we don't actually know much about, we don't know as much about people's choices to actually remain in place. There is, I think, tended to be, at least within displacement research, an assumption that people who don't move would move, but they can't. And that's probably not necessarily true, because some people do decide to remain. Because although they may find themselves in situations that we might think would be extremely difficult to live in, of course, leaving your traditional spiritual home, for instance, or just a place where you have your economic well-being, etc., is a difficult move to make. I wrote down the word trapped before Tim said it, because I think I agree that in terms of that's the big concern around people who are actually trapped, but I think better understanding who is and who isn't is something we need to know more about.
Can I say one more thing about how much space have we got? It's really, so an important, although it might have looked, and it should perhaps look pretty sobering, those shrinkage of areas to grow major stable crops. Everybody should remind themselves that currently 80% of the agricultural land, including pasture land worldwide, is used just for meat, which provides 17% of our calories on average and 37% of our protein. In other words, we could quite happily all feed ourselves with about a quarter of the land. And it's the land to grow the food it's not the physical space to put people in, obviously, but it's the land to grow the food we need as one of the most basic needs that I'm concerned about. And obviously diet is a crucial determinant about them.
So not just forced mobility, but forced dietary change.
I
You're gonna be
would
moving to a new place.
You could put it like that. I'm almost glad that you did, but if we entered into one of these horror show worlds, I suspect we might find ourselves, just as in moments of past wars one could refer to, in that having to adopt that not involuntary, possibly, choice. Let's put it like that.
Thank you. Passion.
Coming off what you both were talking about, actually, then the question about voluntary, about not having anywhere to move to. I wonder the methods by which people do migrate, either internally or between borders. How many of those methods might be closed off due to increased temperatures? Things like roads, just road surface damage, things like that. And if there's any way of quantifying that in a hotter world.
Wow, that's a really good question when you think physiologically and put yourself mentally in the shoes of someone a lot poorer than you are in my case, in a place that's already where you're feeling you've got to, let's say the scenario is you feel I feel compelled to leave here because things are just intolerable, and climate wise and my resource base, and maybe people are starting to fight over the resources, whatever you want to make up, but you just take it as you're in that situation. It's challenging climate conditions anyway. The actual journey of migration, which is often on foot, as to state the obvious, you won't be wanting to do that in some parts of the day, that's for sure. So you're asking a very good question. And I think we already see, I'm not a migration expert, but with my non-expert observation, we see some of that already actually with migrants. It's very dangerous. Well, we saw it in an intentional case of the Hajj last year, when I can't remember how many people died on the pilgrimage, but it's seen more broadly, I think, a super relevant point.
Yeah, a really interesting question. I mean, the first thing that came to mind, which you mentioned about borders, for instance, and the decision to cross borders or not. There are parts of the world where the decision if there was a decision to move internally, there will no longer be that decision. There will no longer be the territory in which to internally move. So there are in the Pacific, people find themselves in a situation where they're having to move internationally, yet they aren't doing so for the typical refugee reasons around persecution by the states, because there isn't that break between them and the states. It's not that they're not being protected by their state, it's that they're physically is not the states, and maybe they're not being protected by other states. So, and obviously there are some things like the recent Australia Ballapilly treaty, which I don't know a huge amount about, but what I do know is that it's an option for people, a certain number of selected people, to be able to move to Australia, and that there are conditions attached to that in respect to the international relations between the states. That it is not an altruistic move.
Yes, please.
I was gonna go back to the borders question and the idea of being trapped versus not trapped, and like, obviously, we've created borders as like a social political context, and increasingly those are being militarized to not even allow migration at this point. It's sort of a warming context, and in the US perspective, obviously it's getting increasingly more difficult for migration and legal, if you want to use that definition, routes in, and people are dying at the border. So I would be interested in your perspectives around like the narrative around being trapped, and what does like border migration look like in increasing militarized context, as well as I was thinking about that. Yeah, what does this look like? Sort of like the negative social tipping points element of it. I'll leave it there.
Very good point. Well, I'd remind everybody that UNDOCs in the US have died due to climate extremes, working in the agricultural fields of California and a few other cases. And I'm sure some of you know much more about that than I do, but so you don't, you might not, points well taken. When I talked about trapped, I actually in my head wasn't conceptualizing it in terms of just of being trapped within a country. I meant it in a much more local sense. It was like I was referring to some conceptually to the notion of a poverty trap, which many people tragically find themselves in for reasons often beyond their control. So I meant it really locally, trapping you to even to get potentially to a better or a less harmful place within the borders of your country. But I take your point. What can I say? I'm not a migration expert. I observe that despite the political rhetoric, when Sunak was in charge, we discover quite understandably privately, there's no great objection to large inflows of migration into our glorious country, because people who in politics who know the economics of this know that it's a net benefit to our economy, and it's the only plausible way people are going to get their pensions paid out for the foreseeable future. So whilst we're all no doubt probably equally traumatized by some of the horrendous cases of border closing, etc., I'm just, despite some of the rhetoric, even in some of the tragically most liberal, neoliberal nations on earth, there's more than one thing going on, I think. Whether it's hard to be optimistic enough to say that we're going to see the kind of I'm thinking of Angela Merkel here, the kind of Merkel-esque kind of facing up to this and saying, having a personal epiphany and then welcoming people in. I'd love to see more of that. I'm not sure we're seeing much of that, but I've said enough. Ben.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's one of the things that it's often a bit of a worry, and I see it as, and there are other people I know, perhaps in the room online, who are better at or working on this sort of quantification of essentially how many people may be displaced as a consequence of climate change. Perhaps some people have started thinking about tipping points specifically as well. I worry when it comes to that, because really, I mean, to me, that's like a call to action, of course, and the sort of action that Tim was mentioning there. But obviously, to many other people, it is a call to action, but a call to close.
Precisely.
It's a threat. And I have talked a bit about this in other forums with people before, and the predominant focus of a few people is that this assumption that we're still going to have millions of people coming to the UK to avoid heat elsewhere. And I think one thing that I guess I'm conscious of trying to do in my work going forward, the big ask, I guess I shouldn't be too ambitious on this, but is to at least change that narrative a little bit to say that, you know, Europe is not, it's not only a receipt country of migration. People are, we just don't talk about it like this, but people are displaced already. And the signs are more people are going to be going forward. So let's stop seeing this as a threat to us. Let's actually come together as a world community. But yeah.
I'm really glad Ben picks up on the UK example. You saw it in, I haven't assigned you a probability of this tipping point scenario I showed you, but were it to happen, all the research we've done so far would suggest you tempted to say there'll be a lot of reasons to want to out-migrate from England in particular as decisively and quickly, because we can't see a way of supporting the intense population density in the southeast because there's a water shortage serious water shortage in the calculations, and let alone we'd be 100% importing our food, not just 60%, etc. So I totally, your instinct that you picked up on that work exactly the right way. I wouldn't bank on this being a great place to be. If that scenario plays out, this country is not going to be a good place to be. Lots of reasons to leave.
And then I guess the question will then be, will we be welcomed with an open arms?
Precisely.
Should we expect
Precisely the right question.
The question?
Yeah, please. So you're mentioning numbers, so we're talking about millions moving. But if climate tipping points hit, and we see a failure of monsoon or rising temperatures in West Africa, it's not a few million people, surely. We're now going to be looking at 500 million people who are on the move. 500 million is going to be the whole new structure within international relations to actually allow 500 million people to move, and for them to even be accepted anywhere, let alone how they go about it. So, is the discussion almost moot? Because if there is no water in Nigeria, and we have 200 million people decide that actually they've got to go, but they're not going to head south, but they'll try and get north. What do they bring? Just the sheer volumes of people will have to be catered for. Does that not need a discussion point and international agreements to actually provide resources and food, water, so those people can move, or do we see them fail to make that move across the Sahara?
Yeah, no, I'm with you on this. I mean, I gave numbers in the hundreds of millions. I didn't say I thought they'd all become migrants. And I also said that it sort of would be the worst of all worlds if some of them were the best, if they had the option to migrate, that would be the best option, and they couldn't do it. So yeah, you're raising exactly the right question about the possible magnitudes, and then some one or ones would do well to look at how much internal migration could accommodate. I'm not sure accommodate's the right word, but could realistically happen. So we could take cases like India or Nigeria. There'll still be rainfall in the nearer coastal southerly regions of Nigeria, but it would be, along with the rest of West Africa, a failure to have the May-June jump of the monsoonal rains into the Sahel. Everybody knows the Sahel and knows that you're talking about a land of getting into a marginal climate where there's a lot of ethno-linguistic diversity and a long, arguably tragic history of conflict between settled agrarians and pastoralists. So you're already talking about complex and multifaceted situation. India, equally, it's a big continent. You can ask, could you go somewhere else in India? But yeah, I can't avoid the same conclusion you're coming to, that one should, in a spirit of, like, I don't know whether you call it risk assessment and risk management or just a humanitarian spirit, one would hope that one could that somebody somewhere would convene to at least start horizon scanning and thinking about how on earth what structures in institutions, I believe is the right word, could function to help support what might coming. Because even if it doesn't transpire, you might get some co-benefits from at least preparing yourself in some institutional sense to consider how on earth we'd ride this out.
You have food stocks already established, and so that again, if there are famines, at least things are preserved.
I think we go back to an earlier question. I haven't thought it through, but I think when we touched on you make a diet, you have to take a diet change. You have to, I hate to say, because you could easily critique me for it, but you have to look at some somewhat relevant lessons from wartime situations when supplies of resources are extremely restricted to dense populations, and look at how those dense populations responded then for some clues.
Yeah, I think it's like you say, it's not necessarily just about big institutions. It's also thinking back to what we said earlier about sort of trapped populations and borders, whether the very I guess geopolitical makeup of the state system can remain if that potentially proves to be a block or an obstacle for people being able to move. And maybe we need to think about it totally differently. I mean, even within, and there are lots of reasons why this is not, in my view, there's lots of reasons why this is not a good idea. But even within sort of law and migration, we've had a decades of talking about how the Refugee Convention is not designed for, well, it's not designed for climate change. It's not designed for different sorts of movements. And people have proposed how it could be adapted, how it could be changed. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And actually probably isn't a good thing anyway. What we haven't done is move beyond that to think about, well, actually, what radically different solutions do we think about? I say solution, I'm not really sure about the word solution because it sounds like something can be solved in a sort of positive way. I'm not sure we're dealing with a positive situation here, but there is a need to respond. And I agree, it's sort of the magnitude where we need to think more radically about this.
Cool. So we're going to take one more question at the back there, yeah, and then I'll ask for some concluding statements because we are coming up for time.
So people online have
Your boss, you tell me how much time we've got.
I'll give you one or two online.
It's surprising that Tim's not said anything yet.
Keeping his powder dry. Yes, please.
So you mentioned mean annual temperatures as one of the main predictors for population densities, and I think you also mentioned precipitation and sea level rise, and often the conversation in climate change focuses on global warming and temperatures, but I'm curious to know if there's any like other biotic or abiotic factors which we're pushing planetary boundaries on and approaching those like tipping points.
Yeah, excellent point. And even in the climate dimensions, the fact that we use mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation with caveats, because as I mentioned, it's the extremes that are playing a role here. It's just that good data for that, and you can start things in the past. And so, great question about the other planetary boundaries that might impinge on habitability. Of course, some of which are correlated to climate, like amount and quality of water flows in our planetary boundary framework. State of nature, I think we're using intactness and integrity as our sort of macro variables in our new Earth system boundaries framework there, but that's clearly getting very degraded for some populations more than others, and that is obviously a habitability constraint. I mean, we can just rewind to growing food. No good if the soil's totally degraded, lost. So yeah, undoubtedly there are other planetary boundary dimensions that stress to varying degrees that are pertinent to the what's really the core issue is some notion of habitability, which no doubt is really complex and multidimensional. And it's something to do with not just what we can tolerate, but food and water supplies and meeting our other basic needs. So, yeah, brilliant. Good one to think. We can go away and think about that, or I can go away and think about that, because we've actually been mapping out the status of the other system boundaries in that paper we did last year, so we could probably take your idea and run with that a bit and see and overlay that.
I'll skip because there's at least 2 words in your question that I didn't understand.
Sorry.
Okay.
Something for me to learn about.
So if we have time, would you like to offer up a question from the interwebs?
You got kind of mixed. What from Tim Malone is, how long do you expect the UN and its guidelines to last once different points framework are related? Steve Smith has asked, there is no definition of a climate refugee, and all the prospects of developing that term and countries reluctant to acknowledge refugees.
Good question, Tim. I'm not gonna give you an exact answer because you'll hold me to it. What I would say about those sorts of frameworks and things I was talking about, they are somewhat untypically for law. They are pretty vague and broad, so maybe they have some staying power, but I don't know how long they're going to last for. And added on to that, there are lots of other initiatives going on. So if you're interested, there's something that's called the Nansen Initiative, which has been working for a decade on cross-border movement as a consequence of climate change, which I guess links to what Steve asked about the definition of sort of a climate refugee. I don't know whether I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head here, but what we talked about, sort of existing structures, state structures, border structures, existing terminology, categories. I just wonder whether it's time to move away entirely from existing categories, because not only is it highly unlikely that we are going to see any sort of positive developments from reopening the Refugee Convention or similar, but also that terminology is perhaps not the best, actually, for those who are themselves affected. So when it comes to examples here in the UK, for instance, of you may know about Fairborn in West Wales, they were termed climate refugees, which is legally incorrect, and they took to be extremely offensive for reasons. So I think maybe we just have to move away from this idea of climate refugee. Maybe it hasn't worked so far, so maybe we move away from that and we think differently. And rather than using terms, I guess, which I guess have embedded within them sort of this idea of lack of voluntariness or lack of agency, we actually think differently in the terminology.
I wouldn't like to make a prediction on the duration of the United Nations, but I would state the obvious that it's things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think those are whatever the fate of the institution, there are some things that we should all fight to retain and preserve, and we should be very clear about which ones. And as other questioners hinted, I mean, there's versions of this horror show future where arguably the nation states as we know them might not persist or might not be very relevant, but we might become the United Peoples, if not the United Nations, at some point in the future, when those that have managed to make it through are redistributed across this reshaped planet.
Okay. Well, let me take the liberty then to ask you for some just brief concluding remarks in response to the following question. Let's be optimistic and believe that we're going to avoid some of these worst climate tipping points. So we're going to avoid AMOC collapse or shutdown. But warming was at an all-time high last year, along with emissions. We're seeing a rollback of climate policy around the world. So things are going to get worse. What could we do right now, both in a climate system science context and a policy legal context, to try to mitigate harm that's going to be produced by displacement, by migration. What do you think we can lean into right now? What kind of science do we need and we should be proposing? And what kind of policy instruments should we be championing?
Well, I might slightly rephrase, because I don't think it's not the migration that's a cause of harm. On the contrary, it could be an alleviator of harm. But if you to open up the choice not to have to migrate, shall we say, then we did some work showing, wow, the potential for extra green space, especially in the slums of megacities in the global south, to ameliorate the heat and humidity extremes that are the most threatening to life in climate change terms, is considerable. Surprise, surprise, there's a kind of inequality in urban green space and its cooling effects between the richer cities and the poorer ones, but that does invite an opportunity for those who are able and willing to invest, because that's the place you would target to alleviate the most direct risk to life. And there are no doubt a raft of other things you can do to try to alleviate the worst proximate extremes, and thus retain some semblance of choice for people. Yeah, beyond that, as I've said before, it's a wishful thinking, but I'd like to live in a world where, you can take migration as a good option when you have the means and when you choose it, as you said, Ben. So I would, I try to answer the question of how on earth we create or maintain that world.
Yeah, I guess, really good question. I think actually talking about migration and reframing this as remembering that migration and moving is a natural part of life, and that it's only a short period of time in which we have held ourselves in certain geographical areas and identified in that sort of way. Actually seeing migration and movement of peoples as actually something that is much more natural and that should be permitted. Permitted isn't even the right word. People should be allowed to make their choices in respect to the movement that they want to be made, and that it shouldn't be seen as a threat to anybody else. Do that.
Okay.
But I'm also very aware, and actually when you asked the question, it reminded me, I was talking just yesterday to someone at UNHCR. They're in a situation where they're having their budgets cut drastically in the next few weeks, and they have no idea how they're going to continue maintaining what they already do anyway, let alone taking on either. So, sorry, I made it negative again.
You did, you snatched
Despair.
lots of, yes, optimism, but we'll take what we can at this point. So we're out of time, unfortunately. So can you just join me all in thanking Ben and Tim? Thank you. Online, and I do apologise if we can get to more questions.
Can I just thank James?
Yeah,
Without almost just amazing as you just
I
stepped
just
in.
appeared, didn't
You
you?
just appeared. So thank you so much for being here as well.
Pleasure, pleasure. And there's tea and coffee. Yay. And sweet stuff.
Brownies.
They said it.
Right.